This is WXOJLP Northampton, 103.3 FM, your Valley Free radio station. Welcome. I'm Warren Odess-Gillette, and this is A Bahá'í Perspective. A Bahá'í Perspective is a radio program that examines contemporary issues from the perspective of the principles of the Baha'i faith. If you want information specifically on the Baha'i faith, you're welcome to visit the website www.baha'i.org. That's BAHAI.org. Or you can call the toll-free number 1-800-22-UNITE. I was recently at a conference called Cultivating Spirituality at the Baha'i Conference Center named Acre in Eliot, Maine. One of the presenters at the conference was Elena Mustakova-Possardt, a Bulgarian educator who came to the United States when communism fell in Eastern Europe to study at the University of Massachusetts. She focused her doctoral studies on the subject of critical consciousness, integrating the heart with the intellect. I was able to pull her aside during the conference to have a few minutes to interview her for A Bahá'í Perspective. The interview is very on location, so you hear the comings and goings of the conference participants during the interview. I started the interview by asking Elena to describe where she grew up and what was it like growing up there.
Well, I grew up in Bulgaria and in the capital, Sofia. Bulgaria is a small country, a very, very beautiful country. In fact, people in Europe refer to it often as the small Switzerland because it has high alpine mountains and very fertile Chernozem black soil. So it was, before the communist revolution, it was really a very prosperous agricultural country with a lot of tourism. It also has the Black Sea, and so it has the alpine mountains for skiing and the Black Sea resorts that really attract, it's an excellent climate, attracts a lot of tourism from Central and North Europe. During communism, however, it was forcefully industrialized, and that brought on a lot of pollution and all kinds of other problems. And that's where I grew up. It is a country that is very well educated. That was one thing that during communism, just everybody got an education. Highly educated and professional society. With challenges that come from that, because in terms of fulfillment and development, the opportunities were very limited, and so many Bulgarians, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, really scattered all over the world. So the small country of about 8 million is now down to about 7 million.
Oh, really?
Yeah, about 1/8 of the population has left the country, and that's, of course, mostly the people who felt they had more that they could offer and develop than what was possible in Bulgaria. So, yeah.
You grew up there through primary school and secondary school and high school?
Yes, I actually got my master's in Bulgaria at Sofia University, and I traveled quite a bit in that time. So I've traveled to various parts of the world, have lived in Arab Africa, also in the southern part of Africa, in Zimbabwe, lived in the United Arab Emirates, traveled throughout Europe and Russia. I had that bounty to travel more than most people really had the opportunity to during communism, because my father was a civil structural engineer, and there was a practice in communist Eastern Europe to export specialists for hard currency. And so my father was one of those people, and I had that opportunity to travel and to explore different parts of the world and to experience life in different parts of the world. And so questions of motivation, human motivation, were always foremost in my thinking. I was always watching and observing and trying to understand why people do what they do. And as I grew older, the question became reframed as, why do people betray each other so profoundly and primarily themselves? So the question of human motivation and betrayal was just really a central question in my life. And after doing a master's at Sofia University in English language and literature, I wanted to pursue literature further, was obstructed from further graduate study because of my parents' non-membership in the Communist Party. So I could not pursue that. I began teaching, but in teaching adults, intensive language acquisition of beginners. It was actually a very interesting process, because to take adults who are professional adults and to submerge them in an environment where they do not understand hardly anything and have to become proficient in about 3 to 5 months is actually a high-stress environment. And human motivations really come forth and become revealed in ways that nobody is prepared for. So it became a very intensive laboratory for study for me, for further study. And at that point, I began to more consistently pursue psychological investigations, and then eventually found my way into Amherst, Massachusetts, to do a doctorate in human development. So that was my path.
Now, before we get to the United States, you mentioned that human betrayal was sort of a, focus for you, and I'm wondering if there was a personal experience that sort of, or what was it that made this such a motivating interest to you?
Well, living in communism primarily, although not solely, but living in a system that was based on human betrayal. In order to keep 8 million people in subjugation, in the case of small Bulgaria, much larger numbers in the case of the Soviet Union and other East European countries, you had to really develop a network of informers. And so that's how the state worked. It relied on a very sophisticated network of informants who would be... so we grew up being told that the moment you leave your doorstep, you really don't know who's listening to what and what will become reported. And one report is sufficient for you to get whisked away into a labor camp and never see another day in your life again, in freedom, in relative freedom.
Right.
So I grew up with that, knowing that, people disappear just because they've made a joke on a bread line or things like that. And so the willingness of human beings to betray other human beings in such a way, and then of course the whole system was set up on a party base. So whether you were a member of the party or you had parents who were party members, Communist Party members, or not, made all the difference in terms of what you could or could not do, including get to higher education. So, and then the ability of people to do all that and to close an eye, and sometimes to close both eyes, and to not ask questions in order to provide for their immediate family's comfort and security, was just astounding. And we witnessed people disappear. So it was, the betrayal was pretty fundamental, and it cut really deep into the fabric of anybody's life. And then when you have a system of such totalitarian oppression, of course it filters on every level of human relationships. So women, for example, were doubly betrayed because communism claimed to give women their freedom, and it freed them to vote and to work. But in the workplace, there was really this invisible inferiority of women, which was completely unquestioned. And a lot of party functionaries relied heavily on a very denigrating attitude to women and the role of women, the public roles of women. And so really, as I said, oppression and betrayal, systemic oppression and systemic betrayal, really pervasive. They permeate into the most private realms of family life. And so I experienced them on every level. And I guess I was particularly attuned to that. That was just maybe the gift that I was given, that was the one thing that really registered on me unfailingly on every level, and every aspect and variation of that really registered on me. And the question of how can we do this? What makes us capable of that? What brings us to that? And for the longest time, I really thought that there's really two categories of people: the people that you can trust and the people that you cannot trust. And the second is a much larger category. Because in Eastern Europe, that was a matter of life and death. It wasn't a matter of intellectual preferences. It was really the difference between continuing to live freely the next day and not. So it's very, very clear cut. And it was a long, long journey for me to discover through my studies and through my spiritual journey primarily that there's really no such division, that there is a human continuum of, our understanding of ourselves, and therefore unwillingness to betray ourselves and others, and greater and lesser degrees of that. So that was quite a process for me.
Now, you said you traveled around the world because of your father's occupation.
Yes.
And you lived in these various countries for some time. but they were also under the communist rule to some extent.
No, yes, and not necessarily. Not all of them were. Some of them were, but I really did see variations on the theme of betrayal wherever I went. More and more I discovered that it was not just predominant in the communist world. Some of the countries that I lived in were sort of friendly to the communist system, like Libya, for example. I visited Russia, I saw a lot of Eastern Europe, but I also visited Western Europe, and I visited and lived in other parts of Africa, as I said, in the United Arab Emirates, and those were not communist countries.
Right.
But I saw various forms of human
Right.
betrayal and
Right.
failure to ask the real questions, which led me more and more to this concept of critical consciousness that I devoted a lot of years to the study of in Massachusetts, in Western Massachusetts, which turned out to be a spiritual phenomenon, really, and that's not what I thought. Zimbabwe was newly liberated when I went to live and work there. It had been Rhodesia until just a few years before I went. And so I had the privilege to be able to teach in a teacher training college, which was newly established. Well, it was an old teacher training college, but it had newly opened to native Zimbabweans. And so I was able to teach the first generation of liberated young Zimbabwean teachers who were eager to go into the rural areas of Zimbabwe and teach the children a liberated understanding of life. And it was shocking to me to see that these passionate young people who were seeking liberation and rejoicing at what they experienced or perceived as liberation at the time were every bit as willing to roll over people and to be oppressive with their own ideological beliefs as the ones that preceded them. And I just saw before my eyes how a process began in Zimbabwe, which we now know has gone much further.
Right.
And it was just astounding how this human story of self-betrayal and therefore betrayal of others keeps repeating itself and playing out in various historical contexts. It just has to be understood in spiritual terms. That's what I came to realize.
Interesting. You had a choice of leaving the country once communism fell in Bulgaria?
Actually, I left the country about 6 months before communism fell. I went to Zimbabwe as a way of escape.
Okay.
I could not stay any longer. And so I was determined to leave, and my family at the time left, the three of us, my husband at the time and my son, we left. We went to Zimbabwe. We were in Zimbabwe when the Berlin Wall fell. But at that point, I knew there was no going back. I wanted to continue my pursuits and study critical consciousness and this understand this human phenomenon. So I was determined to continue further with graduate school and study this.
And you chose UMass?
I chose a number of universities in the United States, mostly in the Northeast. UMass was the one that made it most possible for me to come by offering me an assistantship, which made all the difference because I had no resources. And so that was defining. I guess I was meant to be in that place.
I see. What happened to you when you came to UMass?
Well, I'll take a step back and tell you what happened to me when I came to the U.S.
All right.
To me, U.S. and to most East Europeans at the time, the U.S. really was a symbol of freedom, the land of freedom, the land of democracy and freedom. And I was really shocked in my first few days in Western Massachusetts, walking the streets of Amherst, to see what freedom had amounted to. And the words that I kept hearing, I had been schooled in British English, so I was abruptly making the transition into American English. And the words that were most frequently used that I was hearing again and again was fun, cool, and get.
Interesting.
And I just could not believe my ears. I couldn't. This made no sense. This in no way inscribed itself into my concept of freedom, the way I had constructed freedom in the context of communism. It just seemed so easy and undiscriminating and so casual and so disinterested in a way. And I just could not understand how freedom could possibly amount to this. So it was devastating. The first days for me were truly perplexing. And then I had this very interesting experience. I kept hearing on TV the word consumer, consumer, consumer. And the first few times I heard it, I thought, wow, this is really a self-critical and self-reflective country. Because, of course, in Eastern Europe, to call somebody a consumer was a very negative term. And I thought, people are publicly, criticizing tendencies in their culture, and that's really amazing that this culture is so publicly self-reflective, until I began to realize that it was not used as a negative term. Actually, it was used as a term of pride, as self-definition. We are a consumer society. And so this was when the pieces began to fall into place, and I began to realize the extent to which this mass society has really actually taken away true freedom.
Interesting.
Or lost its way to true freedom, or misunderstood it, or misconstrued it, or somewhere along the way gotten very, very, very detoured. And I must say, it was really heartbreaking to me. There was nothing like what I expected to see.
And that was immediate?
That was instant. Those were my first impressions in the first few days, in the first week. Yes, those were the very first impressions. And so I found myself... I wanted very much to study. I was really enchanted with the environment at UMass, the opportunity for such freedom of investigation and support. Really, I'm so grateful to University of Massachusetts for its democratic commitment, and for the fact that it really came forth and met people like me and made it possible for us to really explore, to make that transition, which was so difficult to make.
Now, what's in it for UMass to offer assistance to?
Well, I think they attract lively minds and souls that are really searching and are willing to do the hard work, and good for them that they value that and are willing to do it. So, yes, I think UMass has a reputation as a university with very democratic commitments, and it really does live up to it, to at least... I mean, it's all relative, of course, but
Sure.
It does strive to live up to that.
There's always room for improvement. But
certainly, but yeah, there is a clear commitment there.
And so your studies were, again, what were you going to pursue at UMass?
I was accepted in the School of Education because initially I thought I was wanting to understand adult, lifelong education. But it clearly, within the first semester, became clear that I was much more psychologically minded. My questions were much more psychologically minded than the program that I found myself in. So I transferred to human growth, to the human development program, and focused particularly on adult development and then on the study of consciousness. So my program actually became self-tailored, and it evolved. And in the second part of it, the actual human development program at UMass was tailored for closing, was actually selected for closing with a number of other programs in the School of Education. Yes, it doesn't exist anymore. But there were some really wonderful teachers at the time, and they continued working with me until I brought my studies to completion. And so I had a lot of freedom in studying consciousness, and I had a lot of external help. I worked with people from Harvard and Radcliffe and neighboring departments at UMass, and it just became my own pursuit.
And I understand you ran into the Baha'i faith in Amherst?
Yes, I did. Yes,
How did that happen?
Oh, as it most often happens, we are sometimes not ready for the spiritual path, for a conscious and deliberate spiritual path, until we've been really brought to our knees. At least those of us who are very intellectually minded and kind of self-reliant, I have to say, that's how it was for me. I found myself on my knees in some very painful personal ways. And at the time, yes, in 1992. And one evening I was in a very difficult place in my personal life. I was single parenting my young son at the time, and there was a lot of really difficult... I was in the process of a divorce, and it was extremely difficult. And I was invited to a fireside. Of course, I had no idea what a fireside was, but the only reason that I got attracted was because the topic was the conditions of women around the world. And I will never forget entering this beautiful home in Hadley with this radiant Persian hostess who came up to greet me, and joining this circle in this beautiful Persian living room. And the speaker was a Nigerian woman who was briefly crossing the United States from the east to the west coast, sharing her experiences teaching the Baha'i faith in Nigeria. And she was an extraordinary woman. I will never forget her. Probably in her mid-50s, in native dress with native headdress. She had the utmost dignity. She was just a presence of dignity, of benevolence, of staunch faith, of vision. And I was just so taken because she was talking about the horrors that women undergo in Nigeria. And she was describing stories that were just really etched in my mind and heart. And yet there was not a trace of resentment or bitterness in the way she spoke. And I was sitting there, an angry young woman of 32, struggling to shed all the layers of oppression in my own life. And I could not for the life of me understand how this woman had been able to shed all bitterness in her life. I wanted to know that. And that's what really drew me. What had happened in her life that allowed her that level of freedom? I did not know that was possible until that night.
What happened after that night?
Wow. It was a sense of homecoming that evening. I felt so at home in that circle. So intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, in every way at home. And I did not even know these people. And that was very mysterious.
Now, what was your concept of the Baha'i faith from just that one evening? Did you think of it as a social movement? Did you think of it as a...
Honestly, I did not know what to think. The one thing that I walked away with is an amazing sense of liberation and enlightenment. And I wanted to know more about what this is really about. That level of liberation and enlightenment which I experienced, what is that about? That's what I experienced. I saw degrees of liberation. I experienced them in a very practical way, just the presence of these people. It wasn't just what they were saying. It wasn't just the intellectual ideas floating in the room. I was already accustomed to a lot of really wonderful ideas. But it was the sense of the extent to which these ideas were actually lived, and these people were actually genuinely much freer than anything I had met, much more open. That was a real homecoming.
Now, were you raised as an atheist under the communist rule?
No, not really. Well, communism was certainly very atheistic, but I always had an inherent sense of the spiritual nature of life. And there was some emphasis on Eastern Orthodox, on Bulgarian Orthodox practices, but they were not particularly meaningful. As more than a sort of a motion to bring you into a space where you can maybe think about the unthinkable. And so for me, I was agnostic, I must say. I always knew that there is a much greater meaning to life than anything I can fathom. And I had experiences of feeling that I'm drawing closer to that, or seeking to draw closer to that. But I had no explicit philosophy other than a very existential agnostic one.
So what happened after the first meeting?
I began to read. I began to investigate. And it was astounding to me because the ideas I recognized very much. It was astounding to discover that a messenger of God had come into this contemporary age and had brought these ideas, and more than the ideas, the understanding, the profound understanding behind them, and the spirit of power and liberation that went with that to the whole of humanity. I had no idea that all of these values had anything to do with religion. That just really burst all of my assumptions of what is the pursuit of truth. I was a very intellectually minded person, and I thought the pursuit of truth was a really rational, linear endeavor. And I was beginning to encounter so much paradox, and that was so liberating. So I began to study that paradox until the moment when my heart really felt it was changed and really ready to embrace it.
That meaning that you became a Baha'i?
Yes.
Yeah. And did that affect your pursuit in your education?
It burst open what I was trying to understand. I had already identified the study of critical consciousness. I came in 1990. By the end of 91, I had identified my focus in the study of critical consciousness. And at the time, my advisors were telling me, this is going to be the work of a lifetime. This is like 10 dissertations in one. You better choose a piece for your dissertation. I kept saying, no, this is the only reason I'm here. It doesn't make sense for me to do anything less than that. That's why I'm here. So I will just have to do the whole thing. And so I was already well into the study of critical consciousness from, I was preparing to do interviewing, I was doing my lit review, I was taking intensive courses, and But then as I launched on a spiritual path, I began to see paradoxes. I began to see things that I wasn't seeing before that. I began to realize that there was a lot more to this thing I was studying, that it was much more of a spiritual phenomenon than anything I had thought. It was not all about people being able to think more consistently. When I began the process, I thought that most people betray themselves and others because they don't think it through consistently enough. But then I began to realize that there's the whole realm of motivation, and it has a lot. Certainly, the ability to think consistently and the commitment to do so are very important ingredients. But there's also the realm of the heart, the motivational realm, and that psychology has very little to tell us about. At least everything that I searched and read really didn't even come close to shedding light on the motivational realm, on the realm of the heart. And so my study became much deeper than anything I had imagined.
And where are you at this moment with that studying?
Well, my book on critical consciousness got published in 2003. I'm sorry.
And what's the title of the book?
Critical Consciousness: Study of Morality in a Global Historical Context.
And who's the publisher?
Greenwood, Prager. And it is a monograph. And I feel that I've come to understand human motivation in ways that really would not have been available to me had I not opened my own heart to the spiritual path. The journey continues, but what is most interesting for me now is how we access this human motivation, how we cultivate critical consciousness in daily life, in marginalized populations, in wealthy communities that are really disempowered in a whole range of other ways. Even in people who
like North America.
Yes, even in people who consider themselves religious and yet are really estranged from themselves, or people who consider themselves liberated and very secular and are equally estranged. I mean, how do we access the human heart in ways that really engage both mind and heart in an honest and harmonized or increasingly harmonized dialogue, inquiry? How do we do this? How do we foster this? How do we educate for critical consciousness? How we raise our children in a way that is true, that both liberates their minds and liberates their hearts? Because I've come to realize you cannot liberate a heart if you don't also liberate a mind, and you can't liberate a mind truly if you don't liberate a heart.
So that's very joined together. They
are very joined together, and it breaks my heart that education has split them so extremely. We are letting down our children. I just resigned from an academic position just a month ago because we're not educating for our children to be really up to life in the 21st century. We're teaching them how to be smart and how to juggle information, but they are disempowered at heart, increasingly disempowered. And 9 years I've been listening to students tell me stories of disempowerment, and I just cannot bear what the system does anymore. I just think we have to become committed to really seriously taking to task our educational system, not just talking about it and publishing papers on that and making individual careers, academic careers on that. I just can't bear to do this because it is at the expense of actually perpetuating the same system. So the one thing that saved me in communism, which was the life of the mind, I found it to be a betrayal when it is not joined with a strong and discerning heart, which is equally cultivated. And so the education that we promise as liberating becomes oppressive in a different way. And I've come to see this to the point where I just cannot do it and continue developing a career. So I left the tenure position and associate professorship simply because I just can't do it in good conscience. And we're just publishing papers.
So what's your plan?
I don't know.
So you're at a crossroads here.
I really am at a crossroad. I am an educator at heart. I always will be. I cannot stop teaching. I am hoping that I will find places and ways that have more integrity and that are really committed to addressing the questions that are rattling the world right now, because the education that I'm seeing is not addressing the issues of the world. There are disciplines and they're working in relative isolations from the realities of life on this planet. The real painful questions of humanity are not being tackled, not in ways that really engage the hearts of our students. The students want to be engaged. The students want to be working in the world. They want the intersection between theory and praxis. But our education is not committed to this intersection between theory and praxis, and is not committed to bringing forth the hearts. We're scared of that in education. We don't know how to touch the heart, and so we try to stay clear of it. And that in itself is a betrayal. So I have to find a way. I don't know.
How do you see this, the result of this segregated education of just the mind without the heart? How do you see that manifesting itself to these students once they leave school?
Well, I've seen a range of things. I've seen us cultivate arrogance, which is very sad because we don't need more arrogance in this world. It is, to a large extent, arrogance along with ignorance that has led us to where we are now. We've got a world that's so split. We're talking about culture wars. And we have arrogance meeting ignorance and clashing, and each pretending to be better than the other. And, we are cultivating that in academia. Unwittingly, unintentionally, we end up cultivating that. So arrogance is one outcome. Other outcomes are despair. I've met and talked to many despairing students who feel that they came because they wanted to understand their worlds better, and they're leaving more perplexed than really understanding. A lot of students come and say, how does everything that I've learned really apply? What can I really do in this world that makes a difference? Theory and praxis, they have to begin to speak to each other. And not as some sort of marginal exercise, as a practicum at the end of a career in academia, but really as the context of just about every course. And so I am very heartened by various endeavors which I'm seeing around the world to establish spiritually inspired universities that are committed to bringing together theory and praxis, interdisciplinary approaches, and the concept of service to the most painful questions of humanity from the beginning to the end of education. And developing the capacities, the capabilities to do that, and engaging both minds and hearts throughout. So these are, to me, the most promising educational endeavors, and I hope to be able to contribute to them. I hope to be able to support them. I hope to be able to see them flourish. I know that sooner or later this will have to happen because our young people are feeling betrayed. So many students came to me and they said, in the particular program where I taught, there's a lot of talk about spirituality. It's not as though we don't talk about spirituality. A lot of other places will not even touch spirituality with a long stick. Our program used to talk about spirituality, but the students would come and say, we're just tired of all this talk. Where is the walk? Where is the walk? What can you teach me about serving people, about serving humanity? What are you guys doing in that realm? And I knew that these questions were very poignant and very relevant. And they had every right to be asked. And that's why I just had to...
So did you try to push the envelope at all when you were...
Very much. 9 years, that's what I did. 9 years. We did... we live in an area in rural West Georgia where there is a real flood of mostly undocumented Hispanic immigrants, which form large sections of marginalized communities. And so for the last 6 years, I've been working with the local marginalized Hispanic immigrant community with my students, developing forms of praxis that seem to make sense in the context of everything that we were studying theoretically. And it was a very heartening process for myself and also for my students. And what really made me leave is realizing that the particular educational institution that I worked under had no commitment to such a process and really did not support it. And so you can only go so far when the institution does not commit itself to such values and is not willing to put itself out to develop this. And so, and there's not an academic vision that is an integral part of education. And so the students love it, but it is very hard to do that against the tide of actually the split. And you feel like you're patching holes and putting Band-Aids, and it's just not right. And what do I tell to my students? I mean, this is not, the 21st century is not a one-man show anymore. We cannot do it as individuals. I don't believe that. Every individual is called on, and we all have to step forward, but we have to work in teams. And we have to find teams of fellow thinkers who are committed, who are willing and capable of working together. It is not about the charismatic individual leader anymore. And so that's what I'm looking for. And I know I've found teams across the country and across the world. They're not necessarily in the same context, in the same geographic place, so there's some very logistical questions and issues and problems that have to be resolved, and I'm sure it will all get worked out in time. But it can be done in no less than teams of people who really realize how pressing this challenge is and are committed to meeting it, educationally and socially. And really, at the heart of all of it is a spiritual understanding and commitment. I'm very clear about that.
Well, Elena, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, and good luck in your search for the right institution for your further pursuits.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful opportunity for me. Thank you, to reflect and to share with the friends who will be listening to your program. Thank you for having this program.
You're welcome. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Elena Mustakova-Possardt, a Bulgarian educator who came to the U.S. when communism fell in Eastern Europe to focus her doctoral studies on critical consciousness. To hear other interviews or to subscribe to a podcast of A Bahá'í Perspective, go to the website abahaiperspective.com. If you want information on the Baha'i faith, you're welcome to visit the website www.baha'i.org. That's BAHAI.org, or call the toll-free number 1-800-22-UNITE.